how do you feel looking back over the 4 years? How much better are we now in terms of a credible deterrent to China vis-a-vis Taiwan?
Well, I think there are two things, just to step back for 1 second before getting to Taiwan. First, the other thing that we've seen over these 4 years, and not by accident, by intent, was greater convergence than I've ever seen in the approach to China by our key partners and allies in Europe and in Asia. And if you look at not only what we say as our declaratory policy when it comes to China, but also look at what we're doing together in terms of de-risking, in terms of making sure that we're dealing with problematic technology transfers, in terms of dealing with overcapacity and unfair trade practices. Increasingly, you have an aligned, unified approach. If you look at the China strategies that key partners have put out, we could be exchanging talking points, exchanging speeches. It's almost one and the same. That's a source of incredible strength, because if we're trying to deal with something that we don't like that China's doing, and it's just the United States alone, we're 20% of world GDP. If we're doing it in a way that's aligned with Europeans and aligned with key Asian partners, we're 40, 50, 60% of world GDP. A much heavier weight that China has to take account of, and it does. And maybe the best proof point of the success that we've had in aligning our policies with Europe and with key partners in Asia is the fact that every single meeting that I've had with my counterpart, Wang Yi, almost inevitably starts with 30 or 45 minutes of a discussion, i.e. monologue, about complaining about everything we've done to align all of these countries. So it seems to me this is the best proof point that we've been very successful in building this kind of alignment, this kind of convergence. Now, Taiwan is, in another way, a really good example of this, because what does China say every time the word Taiwan comes up? Don't even mention it. It's no one's business but our own. What we've been able to do is, I think, open the eyes of almost the entire world to the fact that, no, fundamentally, this is everyone's business. Because were there to be a crisis over Taiwan, the entire world would be affected by it. You've got 50% of commercial container traffic going through the strait every day. You've got 70% of the microelectronics of the chips being fabricated in Taiwan. If that's taken off the grid, you've got an economic crisis that goes right around the world. As a result, more and more countries have weighed in with Beijing in the last 2 or 3 years, saying, don't do anything. We have to preserve the status quo. You have to preserve peace and stability. And the demand signal coming from countries for China to act responsibly is more across the board and clearer and louder than, again, at any time that I remember. And it's another way also of showing the extent to which, Mike, we have broken down these silos, where European friends and partners were concerned about what was going on in their part of the world, those in the Indo-Pacific just in their part of the world, Middle East, Africa, et cetera, their part of the world. What we've seen increasingly, what we've been able to show increasingly, is the indivisibility of security. And as I said before, for the Europeans, when they see China, along with North Korea, helping to fuel the ongoing Russian aggression, they know that what's happening halfway around the world matters to them. NATO. We inherited a strategic concept, as NATO calls it, basically the blueprint that NATO allies agreed to for what the alliance is going to be all about. That when we came in was 10 years old, the word China was not in the document. Now, of course, China is a focus. Not because we want to take NATO out of area to the Indo-Pacific, but because the Indo-Pacific is coming out of area into NATO. Yeah. So I think from where I sit at least, because we've been able to build that kind of convergence, that acts as a much greater deterrent. Last thing is this. China, of course, has watched very carefully and very closely how have we and so many others responded to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And one of the most powerful things that was said at the very outset of the Russian aggression was from the then Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, who stood up strongly for Ukraine, even though this was happening half a world away and not something that would preoccupy most Japanese on a daily basis. And he said at the time, what's happening in Europe and in Ukraine today could be happening in East Asia tomorrow. That powerful statement encapsulated the fact that we've brought countries together in very practical ways to show that we're going to stand together when we have an aggression not only against a country and a people, but against some pretty fundamental principles that we think are necessary to upholding peace and stability around the world.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹、干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，护肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。